Hi, my name is Jesse Roberts. This is my public history project. I'm doing mine on battlefield preservation. Um, the focus of my project is the River Raisin battlefield in southeast Michigan. The River Raisin battlefield in southeast Michigan is known as the only national battlefield park managed by the National Park Service. That represents a location of a battle from the War of 1812. In 1812, while Britain was in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was in dire need of servicemen for their ships that patrolled the oceans to protect Britain from French invasion. So to help fill their ranks, the British began to utilize a method called impressment, where they would stop American merchant ships and take the sailors off and press them into the British Navy. So this sparked a dilemma between Britain and the United States that ultimately became the War of 1812. The war was fought mainly over national rights and maritime rights, and it was basically a war about reputation between the two countries. The United States felt slighted by Britain and felt demeaned by them. So the River Raisin battlefield became a site of relevance, but first, I'm going to give you some background. In 1812, Michigan was a frontier between Canada and Ohio. Ohio had become a state just a few years prior. And there was a fort in Michigan called Fort Detroit. And Fort Detroit needed a connecting road between Detroit and a town called Urbana, Ohio. So the River Raisin militiamen, which were locals that lived in a town called Frenchtown in modern-day Monroe, Michigan, were contracted to build a road, which is called a corduroy road, made out of logs laid flat. And at this time, while they were building this road through a marshland, the War of 1812 began. And at that time, General Hull of the United States Army invaded Canada to try to fight the British first. Since his forces were pushed back and retreated out of Canada, many of them were captured. And so, anticipating this British invasion, the militia of River Raisin ended up occupying Frenchtown in the hopes of holding off a British invasion until the United States Army could come up from the south. So the British actually ended up sending Canadian soldiers and British soldiers into the region to kind of occupy it for a little while. And at the meantime, a United States force of 600 men came forward and ended up extraditing the British and Canadian forces from the region at that time. So at the time, 600 American soldiers came up and occupied the area, and within a few months, the force was brought to 1,000. So by mid-January of 1813, there was nearly 1,000 U.S. soldiers camped on the River Raisin. So on the morning of January 2nd of 1813, 600 British and Canadian soldiers along with 800 Indians attacked the sleeping encampment on the River Raisin. That became the bloodiest battle of the War of 1812. The American right flank completely collapsed, and the United States 17th Infantry took 50% casualties. The left flank of the forces held, but despite the success of the American defense, General James Winchester, the general of the forces at River Raisin, surrendered. When he surrendered, he ended up, the British took the captured Americans back with them, quickly getting out of the area, knowing that future President William Henry Harrison, the general, was bringing up his forces at the time. They left 30 severely wounded American soldiers in Frenchtown. The next morning, however, Indians that were part of what was known as Tecumseh's Federation attacked the wounded Americans in Frenchtown, and they ended up massacring 30 men. So the British sources are a little different on this. They say it was only 6 men. Either way, this became a major moment in the War of 1812. So the Battle of River Raisin, on top of the 30 massacred men and the 400 men that were killed in action, this battle became a rallying cry for the rest of the war. So as the British had pulled out of River Raisin, William Henry Harris had moved north with his troops and ended up going deep into Canada. And the rallying cry at this time was remember the raisin was used as the rallying cry throughout the United States to win the War of 1812. In a similar manner as things like remember the Maine, remember the Alamo, remember Pearl Harbor. It just became a rallying cry for the American forces. So the site of the River Raisin battlefield went through several periods of change, most notable of which being the site for a paper mill that was built in 1911. The paper mill in an adjacent landfill occupied much of the site until 1995. And prior to 1995, closure of the landfill, however, the site was registered as a Michigan Historic Place in February 18th of 1956. And on December 12th of 1982, the site was registered as a location on the National Register of Historic Places. So over the next several years, the park's importance in the public eye began to grow, and in 1990, the Monroe Historical Society, Monroe, Michigan, and the Monroe Historical Commission banded together to open the River Raisin Battlefield Visitor Center. And when the paper mill closed in 1995, the Monroe Historical Society spent ample time tearing down and cleaning up the site, getting rid of the landfill and remnants of the paper mill that were there, trying to get the land back into a more natural condition. In 2009, the River Raisin Battlefield became an asset of the National Park Service. In 2009, at the 111th Congress, the River Raisin National Battlefield Act was passed, and this prompted the National Park Service to conduct a special resource study to determine the eligibility of the site to become a National Park Service site. This coincided with the passing of the Omnibus Public Land Management Act of 2009, which allotted government funds for land conservation for historic sites. The special resource study is a study conducted by the National Park Service in order to determine the national significance of a site or resource. The NPS determines the significance, whether the site is worthy of an NPS management, and the suitability of the site, whether management is viable or not. The NPS also had to determine whether other sites like the battlefield were already represented. And upon further study, the NPS recognized that there were very few battlefields that represented the War of 1812, especially the Old Northwest region of the War of 1812. There were only 9 sites represented in the country, not necessarily by the NPS, but by other organizations. Only 3 sites were actually worthy of visitors, or could be accessed by visitors. So as part of they had to determine the significance. The National Park Service had to also determine whether enough of the park was available to be represented for public enjoyment and education. And most archaeological features of the battlefield still remained, fortunately, including the road built by the militia, known as the Hall Road, the corduroy road built prior to the battle. The actual battlefields, including the 2 peninsulas where most of the fighting happened, along the River Raisin, and the Mason Run River were still usable for interpretation. So as part of the determination using special resource study, the National Park Service determined the significance of the battlefield and potential cultural representations based on the following. The battlefield represents the battle for supremacy or survival, representing a major battlefield of an underrepresented area of 1812 places, especially the Old Northwest region of campaigns. The Battle of River Raisin became significant as a rallying cry. Remember, the Raisin became a unifying moment for the United States, and it was the bloodiest battle of the War of 1812. The battlefield represents other cultures. It was where American, British, Canadian, and Indian forces clashed. And the Federation of Indians, known as Tecumseh's Federation, showed their fighting prowess at River Raisin. The Federation became a symbolic one, showing other Indian tribes the capability of fighting, expansion into their lands. There are still remnants of a rare corduroy road north of the battlefield, known as Hall's Corduroy Road. It was made up of logs going over marshy land, and the road once expanded from Detroit to Urbana, Ohio, 200 miles in length. Okay. Go ahead and stop it. Okay. The National Park Service also determined the site as a fundamental resource, or a site of fundamental values, mainly answering the questions as to why the site should be preserved. The site offers archaeological value testing and other measures those measures have been taken in the area to show the perceived promise of potential archaeology and other valuable types of historical study. A major resource is the battlefield itself. It's a site of the bloodiest battle of the War of 1812, and much of the site is still suitable for study. The physical sites of the battle are still available for study and interpretation. There are various landscape features available for study, including different watersheds and different land areas, to study more of the natural environment of the area. Efforts to preserve the battlefield are still very active. The River Raisin National Battlefield Foundation exists to help restore the area, and efforts to restore Frenchtown back to its original form are currently underway. The foundation also offers extensive educational programs and opportunities. Every year on the anniversary of the battle of January 2nd, commemoration is held where the historians leave a wreath on the battlefield. The battlefield is the site for many community events, including living history events and reenactments. The battlefield at River Raisin is of extensive importance, representing the battlefield that united a young America and helped shape the outcome of the War of 1812. The battlefield today, managed by the National Park Service, is one of only 4 national battlefield parks in the country and is a great cultural and historical resource. Any sources needed about the preservation of the battlefield are available on the National Park Service website, and I will make them available in the abstract to this article or to this video. Thank you.